24th of April, we are beginning our work at the Media Center at Ukraine Forum. My name is Panchenko. We are discussing this morning the topic of safety against violence in the digital space, the way to EU. Our guests are. We will ask Mr. Maxim to begin. Thank you. I am glad to welcome all our panelists and guests and the viewers. We'll be talking about the digital safety covered in the digital space through different prisms internally and internationally, including EU integration, for us to have the basis for our talk. I would like to give the floor to Viktoriia Ahapova, the analyst and the deputy project manager for Reform Index. She will outline basic results that we have found out during our research, the ways how the aspects are highlighted both in Ukraine and throughout the world at the safety against the sexual violence, and then we'll be discussing these issues at the different ways of looking at it. Ms. Viktoriia, the floor is yours. Welcome, everybody. Today's roundtable discussion is very important. I would like to begin with our presentation. Today's issue is the safety in the digital space, the issue of sexual violence in the digital space. The thing is called in different ways, online violence or the violence in the digital space, or are there watchdogs who are dealing with Istanbul discussion? They call it in different ways. This is a new thing for our society. It deals and has to do with the growth of the new technologies. We have seen the most important aspect of that during the pandemics. People started to spend a lot of time on the internet while bringing down the time of offline talking. And correspondingly, the level of the social stress is going up, leading to the upsurge, not only in the domestic violence in terms of physical violence, but also the aggregation and growth of the manifestations of the violence in the digital space. These issues are manifested in a number of ways, including bullying and the theft of emails and digital details, and imposting as other persons, and a widespread of such a phenomena as more severe manifestations, persecution, cyberstalking, the spread of the photographs of the victims, and the spread of the porno pictures with the deep fake technologies, which are sometimes difficult to say the difference between the reality and some made-up participants of the process. In addition, we can also call the factor of instigating the different ways of suicidal manners. We remember a couple of cases when a number of children committed suicides, both in Ukraine and abroad. Such cases are aggregate. They impose one on the other. What they have in common is that these cases of violence, this issue, is really detrimental in psychological, economic, reputational, and sometimes physical terms, leading to the suffering of the victim. The victims of such violence in the digital space does not really depend on the ethnicity, age, or nationality. Most vulnerable groups include children in the first place, women, and the representatives of the minorities, both national minorities and the representatives of the sexual minorities. Correspondingly, they are more vulnerable to this problem, And this issue of violence and the violence per se is a manifestation of the gender inequality. Unfortunately, in 2024, we don't have full-scale data of statistics on the violence and of the problem in general. The assessment has been done on the basis of public opinion. They are very limited, and indeed, it's difficult to assess how widespread the problem is. Here you see some results of our research. We cannot cover all social groups to reflect in full scale who and how, in what manner people are subject to such problems. What we can safely say is that in 2022, the UNICEF conducted an opinion poll covering people aged from 18 to 35, and what we can see is that the majority of the people confronted the issue and some kinds of digital violence. In 2019, your report conducted a poll in Ukraine, younger Ukrainians, people who said that 38% of the people were subject to bullying and other forms of violence. Other manifestations of the issue that have to do with the women is that the Intelligence Economist Unit conducted a poll in 45 countries to the effect that they were trying to work out the best methodology. However, the methodology does not represent a full-scale measure. They claim that 85% of the people polled, women in 45 countries of the world, were either witnesses or knew about the cases of women who were victims of the cyber violence, and 35 of those were the subjects and the victims of such infringements of rights. What we can say here is that a couple of key problems in the sphere of digital safety is that, one, it has to do with the deficit of the statistical data. Now, the problem of the cyber victims in Ukraine has to do with the ensuring of the equal rights. That's part of the program that has been drawn up for the years 2022 and 24. This state strategy says that in Ukraine, we don't have a public record, we don't have such data on the violence. As for the disaggregation, it's not mentioned at all, which is to say that the problem is there, it has to be solved. It's worth noting that this problem is not necessarily Ukrainian in its essence. It is typical for other countries. The problem is quite novel, and all countries are trying to find ways how to assess quantitatively the spreading of the problem. Other countries, including the EU and Ukraine, is the lack of the legal definition and regulation. In Ukraine, we have a definition of what cyber victimization is, but the Ukrainian legislation doesn't say anything about the victims in the cyberspace. NGOs that are working in this domain stress the point and focus on the issue of the need for the definition of this problem, and this is the way to respond to it. The third point is that it's quite difficult to collect data and evidence. Technical restrictions in this domain are very important because we don't know who has perpetrated the criminal act. Stereotypes are the fourth point. One of the key issues here is that the damage to the society is less appreciated than it should be done. If we know that some people throw slander, it's not worth noting. But indeed, the academic data is that the victims of the cyber crimes are 2 times more prone to commit suicide. The last point is that there is a lack of digital awareness of the Ukrainians. Basic Ukrainian need for an introduction to the course of in the secondary schools, for children to know that their data should not be put online, not to share the information about their data as far as bank accounts are concerned, etc. These seem to be the key points that we want to discuss this morning. This is not an exhaustive list of problems. This is only the groundwork to build on. The experts who are working in this realm are, of course, more expert in this area to say and strategize for the future. I would like to extend our thanks to the Ukraine Forum and Media Center and Ukrainian Forum for an opportunity to hold this roundtable discussion. It has been supported by the EU and the Ukrainian Women's Fund, and I hope this discussion will be fruitful. Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am. The research that you have conducted has outlined the key points for the further discussion that will be building on our discussion with the lenses and perspectives for our experts to talk about. I will introduce Myroslava Markova, the analyst at the VoxCheck, Mr. Panchenko, the head of the cyber police department. Ms. Iryna Popika is a lawyer, and Yulia Dmytruk is a lawyer at the Strada-Ukraine. These are our today's panelists. We'll have 2 experts joining us through Zoom, so we will have the opportunity to look at the issue from different perspectives. Marta Martsinko will also join us, the lawyer, and Anastasiya Dyakova is the founder of the educational project Stop Sexting. Welcome, dear panelists. I would like to begin the discussion with a starting point, and the question is this. If we look at the results of the research that we have just seen and heard, as relates to our immediate expertise, what are the key challenges in the context of securing the safety in this issue in Ukraine? What should be our priorities? What is to be done in the first place? What goes beyond the middle-term perspective, where the NGOs and the government bodies will be ready to act on this? Who would like to begin and take the floor now? You have 3 or 4 minutes at your disposal to highlight key points as regard the challenges we face. Welcome, and thank you for the research. My name is Markova. I work for the VoxCheck. This project is dealing with the checking the facts on the net. From our expertise over a couple of years, I would like to say a few words about the challenges that we face. VoxCheck, for example, is a fact-checking partner of Marta organization, where we check the information on the Instagram or Facebook, and the key points that Viktoriia has highlighted are exclusively what we see. For example, different schemes that Ukrainian users are very much vulnerable to. Sometimes people are asked to provide their bank details. One of the biggest challenges and the threat is coined in one word, Russia. And there are a lot of Russia-originated campaigns targeting Ukraine on different platforms, not only on Instagram or Facebook, but the key and best platform is the Telegram, the organization that does not provide transparent policy, where the hate speech is allowed, and this is the place where such policies are blossoming, I would say. Disinformation campaign, discrediting campaigns against women. There are a lot of evidence on that, and we have been keeping record of that. What we can say here, not about the disinformation of fakes per se, but rather the attempts to psychologically pressure the vulnerable walks of life of Ukraine, including attacks against Ukrainian servicemen and women, discrediting our volunteers and discrediting Ukrainian policymakers, women including through the gender signs. There are a lot of things to this. Unfortunately, I wish we had such systemic research done to see the tendencies, but we are keeping record of what we see in everyday life, and we are trying to make record of that. These campaigns cannot be combated, they cannot be cooperated with. This is where fact-checking ends, but the psychological operations are targeted towards weakening the women's part of the society. This is what we see at the fact-checkers and those who fight against the disinformation campaigns. As far as I can say, there is a gray zone, the legislation, plus the protection of personal data, which opens up a Pandora box in different spheres of misguided actions. In the first place, as you mentioned, these acts target women. What are other challenges that we see in terms of securing the online safety? Welcome. As a lawyer, I deal with the cases that have to do with the sexual violence. I also deal with the family law. And this is where we see the interconnect with the domestic violence. When we talk about the crimes in the online sphere, they seem to be connected to the cases where we deal with the domestic violence and the relationship between members of the family or former members of one family. Where we talk about the lack of legislation mechanisms, we proceed from the point what has been regulated already. When we talk about the relations between family members or former family members, we can be guided by the legislation, including the law on the prevention of domestic violence. We can also take on board the Istanbul Convention. The main problem is that legislation, regulation, and the availability at the legal level, the fact that cyber crimes are liable, this is where the legislation should be changed to criminalize some crimes. So we are not talking about the specificity of criminal law providing for the criminal liability and administrative liability. Can we talk about this along this line? So, Yevhenii, when we have talked about the perspective of the people from the side of the view of the victims. As a law enforcement officer, what challenges do you see there? It's a pleasure to discuss this issue of online violence and to raise important points. What I have to add here is that, in general, a clear-cut situation that is so bad, it's not there. Regulations, some novelties that have to be introduced into the law must be studied, but we don't see this dramatic growth of crime rate. We should be discriminating between the online violence. What I see that the fraud and the collection of the personal data, attack against some data, including bullying and other forms of, deep fake. These seem to be different directions. They're not an umbrella term for the crimes. We know about the criminal cases and those cases that target crimes against the limb and the health of people. When people are pressured, they are part of the fraudulent scheme. This is not a general case. I wouldn't say that everything is bad today. We have different sites for people to appeal to us, and there will be also always issues of how to prove the guilt. Yes, there are gaps in the Ukrainian legislation. Let us do the best possible legislation, best in the world, but there will be platforms that are beyond Ukrainian jurisdiction. Does that mean that they will have to adjust to the Ukrainian legislation? Are they to respond to our appeals? The picture should sometimes be broader, sometimes more focused. We are providing a lot of public awareness campaigns, including the Brahma project. We publish a lot of material of how not to be liable to different fraudulent schemes and different psychological operations. This is a lot of work to be done. It's not a matter of reacting to what has happened so far. When the crime is there, it has to be done in a preventive format. And now in the environment of war, we know how difficult the situation is. We cannot respond to every challenge we see within the Ukrainian legislation if the perpetrator is in Russia. But to prevent this, to raise public awareness in Ukraine is something that we do. It's so good that fact-checking organizations are here, NGOs are here, and experts are here. They draw up very good recommendations, they print different posters. It's a good thing. There is always work to be done. As for the information that we have seen so far, our presentations say that there is a lack of statistical data. My response is that on our way to Europe, everyone can say that we are trying to bring down the bureaucracy. We are saying that the community and the society demanded that data should be decreasing. What we hear now is that data must be growing up. If we look into some specific cases, some specific facts on the internet, that tends to for the data to grow. Let me assure you, data are collected. There is no need for special registers. You have special filters to sort out different criminal investigations in different spheres. Unfortunately, we have to admit that the responsibility for bullying, for example, is not singled out in the criminal code, but it's there in the administrative code. If we weigh today, say, shall we say, a sexual violence against murder. I think it's a matter for discussion on how deep and how fast criminal code must be changed for us not to jump the gun. As for different stereotypes that we see in every society, yes, they are there. They should be combated. Public awareness campaign to tell them what the preconceptions and bias are. Prejudices are there. They grow from the Soviet times. You know, equality is something that is spelled here in this booklet writ large. This is what has brought us together. I think there are other people willing to participate in this discussion, including the matter of the statistics. It's not about severe system. It's not about lacking data. You see, we need to have data for us to pass a worked out decisions. We have to have some empirical data. It's not a matter of accumulating them or decreasing them. I would like to give the floor perhaps for a question or a comment to focus on the work of La Strada and JurFem. You deal with the digital epoch, if the term applies. What is the demand? What are the prevention demands? What are the needs for the public awareness campaigns when we compare administrative and criminal codes, the difference between the bullying and the murder, what the state should be focusing on? The floor is yours. Welcome, colleagues. My name is Anastasiya Dyakova. I am the founder of the educational project Stop Sexting. I wish I were there with you, but I have to join you online. I think this discussion is important. When we launched our work at the presidential office in 2019 and in the cabinet of ministers, we were trying to put this process moving. There are, of course, a lot of people who are living literally online. A couple of comments. I will divide them into 4 groups. The international trends and typical Ukrainian trends, and what do we have to do with them? I think the problem was there well before the COVID appeared. This is what our network investigated. Of course, the sexual violence against children, for example, was there before the COVID. In general, I think the Ukrainians are not covered in terms of the polling. But in 2021, we conducted a poll amongst the Ukrainian youngsters as for the pornography. Now we will be discussing these issues in the context of the war and the use of the AI. The results will be available later. As for the fact, what we see in Ukraine in terms of the children's safety online, what we see is that the victims of sexual violence are younger and younger. We used to talk about 40, 60 years of old. Now we are talking about children younger than 14 years old. It's a matter of when and how do we talk to children about the sexual violence. Our colleagues from the Watch Foundation, one of the biggest world organization that deals with the exposing children's pornography, they say that every 140 seconds they find an information on the web. We are presenting this organization in Ukraine fighting against such contents. We are aware that the results and the risks the children faced are there, but the war has had an impact on the children. Children are in a stressful situation. the lack of sleep. Children tend to be less critical about what they see. And you see, the military content, for example, is there on the net. Of course, it has to do with the violence, and the information must be widespread. We know that, of course, the challenges are there, but there are new vulnerable walks of Ukrainian society. Ukraine is on her way both to European Union and to the victory, but the world also is developing in parallel, and the AI is something we cannot pay lip service to. AI is used to create the materials with the sexual contents when the photographs are imposed on one another. And the question for our law enforcement is whether they are ready to deal with the child's pornography, whether they are ready to investigate something that has been done in the United States, in the United Kingdom. The challenge for us is how do we respond? The third point is about international trends. I am currently in London, where I study at the London School of Economics. Britain now is a leading country in terms of the online safety. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from here. Europe seems to be on the parallel way, as is the United States. I think a similar legislation will be passed in Europe in terms of the access to pornography, with a checking of the age of the user. It's not a matter of clicking on the button, I am older than 18 years old. So we'll have to regulate the AI and regulate the use of the violence content, the use of the pornography contents, especially when it comes down to children. Another point, the fourth point that leads me to a conclusion. Where do we go? I think that once in Europe we see the legislation on the access to pornography, it will be impacting Ukrainian legislation. We have mentioned on a number of occasions, including today, our way to the EU, which should be reflected in Ukrainian legislation. It should be mentioned that AI regulation, the decrease of the possibility of children to access pornography, I will not be talking about how detrimental this is, but we should be dealing with the issues that are past our due. For example, the children materials dealing with the children being violated on the web. Our minister mentioned that already. Grooming and bullying, of course, is there, but in the parliament we have seen strong opposition towards deleting, a mandatory deleting of such materials on the net. The court's decisions have not been there so far, banning such content. So access to porno, AI regulation, deleting content of the violence, including children. And as for the regulation, there are 2 points to be mentioned. We should be aware that when two kids are dating, they share the private photos that comes under the legislation as sharing pornography. It's a serious matter to be discussed, and the matter of how to bring to justice such acts. When we talk about the online, we tend to talk about different situations, but the key point here is the human being. We should not be thinking in terms of the bringing people to justice or deleting the contents, but we should be aware that the victim should be helped, rehabilitated. More often than not, children who suffer, they also suffer physically. In Sweden, there was a case when online abuse was equaled to a criminal liability for rape. So there are 3 key tracks here: regulation, responsibility of the criminal, what and how to deal with the contents, and how the victims should be helped. Thank you. Anastasiya, for this addition of a number of points. We began with the minorities, with women, with children. Now you have mentioned other issues that correlate with the psychological or sexual violence, for example. When we start to talk about the aspects that call for spreading and widening these issues, we talk about regulation. We mentioned that there are a couple of platforms that are beyond our grasp. Then how do we secure the safety of the Ukrainians? How does Ukrainian legislation reflect those challenges for us, not only to protect our community, but also bring the criminals and perpetrators to justice? This is where I have an addition to make a couple of points, and then we'll be moving towards the second aspect of our discussion, the way to go. I also call on our viewers on different platforms, feed in your questions, and I will include them into the space of our discussion, and our panelists will respond. Thank you. I am Yulia Dmytruk, representing the Strada-Ukraine NGO. I am a lawyer at a NGO platform, and we also have a hotline on prevention of domestic violence, human trafficking, and other issues. A little bit of a commenting on what has been voiced this morning. The national hotline receives a plethora of calls and messages regarding the fact that there is a sexual violence on the net against women and children and girls. It may seem that such issue is quite limited, but in fact, it's huge. There are a lot of things to be talked about here, and this topic is wide. When people contact the hotline, and this is a mother of a girl who has suffered from the sexual violence online, it's one situation. But there are instances when women contact us, grown, well-educated women who have suffered from such types of violence. When we consult them and we inform them where to turn to, what the recourses are, how to bring the perpetrators to justice, we are not sure that they make this second step. The crime has taken place, but it's difficult to record it. A girl or a boy or a woman who have suffered from such sexual violence or grooming, it has taken place. The situation is there. But the perpetrator has deleted all the material that he or she was sharing on the net, and there is no way we can record this. What is the way to go for this woman or a kid? What we say is that, of course, you have the right to turn to the police, but we are not sure that this will be followed up. And there are a lot of cases to that effect. Other cases include cyber stalking. What we say here is the stalking that will be initiated into the Ukrainian legislation. The bill is now under consideration, providing for the criminalization of stalking as a part of the sexual violence. But the cyber stalking is also taking place on the net, and this is a gender-motivated sexual violence, something that must be punished. in one way or the other, in spite of all the fact that the data are not there, statistics is not available, the problem is there, and our callers talk about these problems. Unfortunately, we don't see how such situations are resolved. It's good that we have touched upon such an issue. Public must be aware of this problem, but it does not lead to the result that we would like to see. Marta, I think I saw your hands raised. Do you have something to say? Yes, welcome. I represent the Association of Women of Ukraine. I would like to add a couple of recommendations on what has been said this morning. My recommendation is to criminalize, or at least to add as a qualification circumstance, when we talk about stalking and sexual harassment on the net, cyber flashing, and the sharing of the photos of the intimate nature. We should also initiate an effective system of punishment, and we should draw up mechanisms to keep track and expose such acts on the internet. I think also it makes sense to raise the public awareness of the law enforcement officers, for them to know how to respond to such acts and how to deal with the victims. Law enforcement does not seem to be taking this online criminal acts as serious as offline crimes. Of course, digital safety is very important. It has to be on the agenda of the public awareness. There are laws regulating these issues, and of course, access to justice is very important. It has been mentioned this morning that indeed we have some communication campaigns and public awareness campaigns, but I think it's good, it's better than the situation was 5 years ago. So our recommendation is to go along these lines and to inform the public on the availability of different recourses and ways to contact the police. Very often we know that victims say that once the police answer that if it's online, it doesn't really constitute an act of crime. When it happens offline, come and we'll deal with you. Now, as for the law enforcement officer, the question is, how ready are we to respond to the AI-instigated crimes and other new phenomena that we see online? Of course, we are ready. Cyber Police of Ukraine, if you will be interested in, we are the top 10 cyber police forces in Ukraine. We've been developing for 6 years. It's been a phenomenal growth. We are ready to respond to the virtual crimes. It's not that we're learning today. We are teaching other law enforcement bodies, including courts, anti-corruption bodies, how to record. Of course, we are not against learning, against developing new technologies, but the situation is not bad as you seem to think. Sexual violence, especially against children, is something that we take extremely seriously. These are egregious acts, and we are working with the victims as well. We receive information not only from the victims, the NGOs, the hotlines, the Center of Rehabilitation and Help are the bodies that we receive information from. At the same time, my point is that the latency of such criminal acts is something of a burden for the NGOs and other civil society groups. It's important for them to share information about such crimes. If you say the problem is very big, my answer is that cyber police is providing and open a number of investigations. Last year, for example, we detained and recorded the activities of 4 pedophiles, you know, it's quite an important number because the problem is very important. My point is that we respond in an efficient way. This is not to say you're wrong to say that we discriminate against online crimes vis-à-vis the offline crimes. Thank you, sir. I think there's a response from Anastasiya, and then I will put for the discussion another point. Thank you. I think I will comment on the point that pedophile is not a person to be criminalized. My point is that what Marta was talking about, and I see eye to eye on, is whether police will accept such appeals as far as online violence is concerned. We've seen and have polled thousands of children. We've talking to a number of police officers. Unfortunately, when it comes to the government bodies, what we hear is that it has happened online. It's not that serious. If a kid was raped offline, that constitutes a criminal act. But online is something we don't deal with. As for the cyber police, it's so good to hear from the officer that this is their priority. But I think that the area of priority is also defined by the capacity and by the manpower. The Ministry of the Interior and National Police, we've been talking about 5 years now that 1 or 2 persons cannot provide security for millions of children. It's not that real. You know, there are 2 officers working in the sphere of child pornography online in the national police. I think the priority should be there. In Britain, for example, there's a special department that has more than 100 officers. The department was set up 10 years ago. I think during the war grinding on in Ukraine, it cannot be done. But I think that the priorities should be very clear. Yes, a lot of people are living abroad now, but 2 officers cannot possibly investigate children's online sexual violence. I think it should be your priority. Thank you. Indeed, there is a demand not only for the law enforcement, but for their command as well that deal with these types of crimes. Let me also draw your attention to the fact that we began by saying that there is a new challenge. It's a new realm. And Ukraine is now building and trying different ways how to institutionalize our response, both at the government level and at the level of the NGOs, to provide security and safety for the Ukrainian public, whether they belong to different age groups or minority groups. This is where we began by mentioning that Ukraine is on her way to the EU. Within the time space that we have at our available to us, I would like to focus on now and to define for yourselves what seems to be priority number 1 vis-à-vis the EU integration for Ukraine in terms of the safety of the citizens online. Ukraine is in line with a lot of trends, and there's a lot of work that has been done, but it's important that the government is building up its infrastructure. It's good, but where do you think the problems and challenges are in terms of the war, in terms of the legislation, and the platforms that are beyond the Ukrainian legislation? What can potentially be, not as a zone of influence, but something that will trigger the society to be more aware? 2 points, what has been done and what is likely to be challenging us in the future based on our European integration and our way towards Europe. Who would like to take the floor and to launch this part of the discussion? I will give you the opportunity to talk. Anastasiya will begin, and then our police officer. It's good when you have some time to think. What I think we are facing is this. EU will not be able to influence all aspects of the Ukrainian legislation. What I think will happen is that access to the pornography contents, when you have to submit your age, and this has been regulated very seriously, regulation of the social media. Of course, there are limits where we can impact platforms beyond Ukrainian legislation. This is what I hear here in the United Kingdom. I think United States bodies will lead the way here. I also think that we are likely to see the hurdles in terms of the deleting contents that has to do with the kids and children's pornography. The hosts themselves must filter such information, and they must block or delete such information. The AI impact. The world tendency is that web design is that a priori, the content should not be detrimental to the users. This is what is being done in England. Of course, Ukrainian IT sector is powerful. I think this is where we should be thinking how to use technologies that we are developing, technology that are used by the younger and elder users. So from first step, there are some technologies developed. These seem to be the 3 or 4 trends: checking the age when accessing pornography, deleting and blocking such information, and AI and web design are the 4 main points. Now, in the first place, it's important, very good comment about the safety belts that are being developed. You see, market will deal with such safety belts and safety cushions. You know, they will be redesigned and resold. There's one thing when the developers are thinking, and the other way how these technologies are used. What is our strategy in terms of risks that we are likely to face on integration to Europe? What have we achieved? Today, the key priority of the Ukrainian integration to EU is to work out the methodology of EOCTA and SOT. These methodologies have been used by the Europol, and National Police of Ukraine for 2 years now has been working to introduce this standard to assess the criminality rate in Ukraine. It does not necessarily is based on the statistics, but on the state of criminality per se. One of the aspects of that is the online criminal acts. Adaptation in introduction, of course, will take place shortly, and it'll be another basis for Ukraine to be integrated to the EU. Colleagues, do you have anything to add? Now, by way of drawing the conclusions, the topic that we are dealing with as an NGO, I think one of the preconditions for Ukraine to join EU was the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and the norms are implemented into the Ukrainian legislation, including prevention and combating violence against women and girls. It's a good thing. We think it should be adjusted, and the combating methodology must be approved and improved. It makes sense for the state to introduce responsibility for the online violence. The issue must be taken on board. It should be paid a serious attention to. And currently, we don't see a lot of information to that effect that is discussed. It is good to have the criminal liability for online criminal acts or other ways of liability. As it has been mentioned already, EU integration, of course, Ukrainian legislation is being brought in line. And we have developed quite good legislation. The challenge may be that implementation is the problem. Even if legislation will provide the responsibility for the online sexual violence, but at the level of law enforcement, at the level of the government bodies, it must be ensured that when people are appealing to them, the response mechanisms are there. The professional level of the law enforcement must also be raised. And public awareness must be raised as well, to the effect that there are acts that lie under the category of criminal crimes. We'll give the floor to Marta and then to our officer. Now, my addition is that the last breakthrough is the directive on fighting the domestic violence and protection of women, which include the computer crimes as Euro crimes. Once Ukraine has become EU member, it'll be on the list of the Euro crimes. So such acts will and must be criminalized. Once, as I have mentioned, we have become EU member, such acts must be criminalized, not to be satisfied with the level we are now instigating suicide. These things will have to be criminalized. Just 2 words. The resume of this talk seems to be to the fact that there is no responsibility. It's not there. There is part 16 that includes cyber criminal acts. Experts know what they talk about, but the viewers must be informed that there are a lot of cases where such cases are criminalized. Believe me, you are not supposed to be bullying people online and you will go unpunished. You will be found and you will be punished. Of course, our system is very flexible. Before slaring somebody, you should read the criminal code because you will be found and you will be punished. Indeed, the system of defense is growing, it's not static, and digital platforms are not also treading water. They also are developing. And law of enforcement, of course, is challenged here, how to find the ways to deal with the risks and expose the perpetrators, a system that must be effective in terms of providing the human rights protection and the protection of the victims. I would like to thank all the panelists for your different perspectives and the foci. We've been talking not only about the need for adaptation from an external point of view, but we've been dealing with what Ukraine has already done and what are the comprehensive documents that has to be implemented. Istanbul document, for example, the instruments that have been implemented into the Ukrainian legislation. Ukrainian developers are also called to develop their answers to the digital sphere. We are likely to see the Ukrainian solutions to securing internet and online safety. The government and business will be talking about that problem, something that, of course, we will need not only during the war, but this will be a basic for our life well beyond the war. Thank you for participating. I would like to give the floor to our moderator, Svetlana, from the Ukraine Media Center. I would like to thank our online and offline participants. We've been talking about the safety against the violence in the digital space in the way to the EU. We'll be talking about that a couple of hours later. At 1400, we'll be talking about the memo for the law enforcement for the provision of the criminality penalty for the sexual abuses. Don't go away.